I didn't stop because I was tired. I stopped because I couldn't keep pretending I had somewhere to be. The road was empty. Just like me. I didn't have a plan. Didn't tell anyone where I was going. Didn't even pack properly. I just drove. And when I saw that broken motel sign blinking through the fog, I thought, if they have a room, maybe I'll take it as a sign to breathe. It's strange, isn't it, how you can be surrounded by people, by noise, by routine, and still feel like you've gone missing inside your own life. That was me. 42. Divorced as of yesterday. No kids. No fight. No goodbye speech. Just 2 signatures. And a silence I wasn't ready for. So I turned off the highway. And I let that silence take me somewhere no one knew my name. Have you ever done that? Not run away exactly. Just stepped out of your story for a minute to see if you even mattered in it anymore. If you've felt that, then stay. You'll understand what I found in room 17. I don't remember turning the engine off. I just know I sat there for a while, my hand resting on the steering wheel, the skin on my palm cold like it had let go a long time ago, and I was just now catching up. The passenger seat held a canvas bag. I hadn't packed much. No one really prepares for a trip right after signing divorce papers. A few clean clothes, a phone charger, and a small cloth pouch I didn't even realize I brought. It sat tucked in the side pocket. Inside my wedding ring. And a faded pink hair tie. It had been a gift from my best friend's daughter years ago, back when I was still preparing for my wedding. "You have to keep this," she said. "It's light but it's happy. I never used it." But I never threw it out either. Funny the things we hold on to. Even when we have no reason to. The bell above the door chimed when I walked in. Not loudly. Just enough to let someone know I was there. It smelled like lemon polish. And something older, maybe old books or the kind of wood that remembers every winter it survived. She was already behind the counter. Didn't flinch, didn't look surprised. Just looked at me like she'd seen me before. Like she'd expected this. Her name tag read Marjorie. Hair pulled back in a twist. Hands folded like she had time to wait. Looking for a room, her voice was soft, but it reached me like a thought I hadn't wanted to say out loud. I nodded. Didn't ask the price. Didn't care about the view. I just wanted 4 walls that didn't have memories stuck to them. She slid the guestbook toward me. The pen felt heavier than it should have. I flipped a page and noticed some names were underlined. Others were scratched out. One had a little heart next to it. I didn't ask. I just signed my Nora L. She paused, then handed me an old key, not a card but an actual metal key with a brass tag that read Room 17. And just as I turned to leave, she said something that made my spine go still. "I was waiting for you." I froze. Not because of the words, but because of how familiar they sounded. That's what Caleb used to whisper. Right before he pulled me close on weekend mornings when the world still felt like it had room for us. But now that room had a number. Room 17. And maybe it wasn't the divorce that broke me. Maybe it was how easy it was to disappear. The walls didn't creak that morning. They just held their breath. Like even the wood knew silence could be louder than anything I had left to say. The heat had kicked on sometime before dawn. I heard it hum through the vents, steady low like a tired sigh. That and the sound of snow falling outside. Or maybe it was just wind dusting the windows. I hadn't slept much. Not because of nightmares, but because the stillness didn't feel like rest. It felt like someone was waiting for me to say something. Even if no one else was in the room. I sat up slowly. Blankets still tucked around my waist, hair flat on one side. The kind of sleep that leaves no imprint, just a gap. My phone buzzed once, then stopped. I didn't check it. I already knew who it was. Mom. She always called around 8:15. Not to ask how I was, but to fill the space with questions I didn't want to answer. "Are you coming back for Sunday dinner? Do you want me to save the lasagna pan I washed your blue sweater? Do you still want it?" She never once asked if I was okay. Maybe she didn't want to know. Or maybe she already did. Mothers can be strange like that. like they'd rather clean around the grief than touch it. I pulled on a sweater, then opened the drawer in the nightstand, expecting a Bible. Or maybe an old map of Vermont ski trails. Instead, there was a crumpled food order slip. Not mine, someone else's, but the handwriting that was Caleb's. I didn't want it to be. But it was. He always wrote in block letters, sharp. Slanted a little left. Like he was trying to be neat but rushing anyway. The top of the slip said shrimp soup. Extra lime. No cilantro. And below that a room number I didn't recognize. Dated. 6 days before the divorce papers came. I stared at it longer than I meant to. Shrimp soup. I'm allergic. He knew that. Or he used to. I folded the slip carefully. Didn't tear it, didn't throw it away. Just slipped it back into the drawer like putting a truth back where it wouldn't be seen. Someone knocked gently. I didn't jump. I was too tired to startle anymore. Marjorie stood there with a tray, a chipped mug, 2 slices of toast, and a packet of butter that hadn't fully thawed. She smiled, the kind of smile that didn't reach for small talk. Fresh as I could manage, she said. Then added like an afterthought, there's a trail behind the inn if you feel like walking. I nodded, though I didn't plan to go anywhere. She placed the tray on the little side table by the window. As she turned to leave, she paused and held something out. A small, plain notebook. Spiral bound. Cover soft from use. No pressure, she said, but sometimes people write things here they can't say out loud. I took it. Not because I had something to write, but because I didn't want to keep holding everything in my hands. I sat with the notebook unopened for a long while. Steam from the coffee curled up between us like it was trying to read over my shoulder. But I hadn't written a word. I stared at the blank page. White, quiet, almost too clean. It reminded me of Sunday mornings in our old kitchen. The way Caleb used to hum off key while making breakfast. He always got the coffee just right, 2 sugars, no cream. But he never remembered I hated grapefruit. Every time that same pink half on my plate. I used to think it was cute. Endearing. Proof that he wasn't perfect, but he tried. But over time, I stopped reminding him. It was easier to just throw it away when he wasn't looking. That was the thing. Our marriage didn't fall apart in one big fight. It chipped away in small ways. A bowl of shrimp soup. A grapefruit I never asked for. A birthday card signed Love Caleb but with no note inside. Little silences. Not loud enough to argue over, but deep enough to echo. I finally opened the notebook and wrote 2 lines. I faded first. But he let me. Does forgetting become a habit? I stared at those words until they didn't feel like mine anymore. Then I closed the notebook, pressed it under my palm like I was trying to hold something steady. The radiator knocked in the corner. The toast had gone cold. And outside the window, snow was falling again, quiet, almost apologetic. There were times even before the end when I'd walk into a room and feel like the furniture noticed me more than he did. It wasn't malice. It was absence. He was there but not reaching, not asking, not remembering the things that used to make me laugh, not noticing when I stopped. I think the first time I felt it clearly was a Tuesday night, maybe 3 years before the papers. We were watching some show he liked, courtroom dramas. I'd just gotten back from work, my shoes were soaked from rain. And I said quietly, "Do you think we're happy?" He didn't answer. Not right away, not even with a lie. He just reached for the remote and turned up the volume. That silence was louder than anything. Sometimes I wonder if he even remembers that night, if it stuck with him, if he realized in that moment that something had cracked, but probably not. Some men forget in pieces, some forget all at once, and some they just never look close enough to notice what's missing. I looked down at the little journal. Still closed, now resting by the empty mug. The ink from earlier had smudged slightly where I'd touched the page too soon. I faded first. But he let me. It felt more true now than when I wrote it. More mine. I wondered if other women had written in it. Poured their quiet heartbreak between these pages and left it behind with the room key. Maybe this place was full of things we couldn't carry anymore. Marjorie knocked once before pushing the tray cart in again. No words. Just a nod, soft eyes, a folded napkin placed next to the journal. On it scribbled in blue ink. The trail out back is quiet this time of year. If you need to walk off whatever you're holding. I looked up. She didn't stay. I waited until her footsteps disappeared down the hallway. Then I glanced out the window. Everything was still white, still hushed. The kind of silence that feels sacred, not empty. I slid the food order slip back into the drawer. Didn't tear it. Didn't throw it away. I just couldn't. It wasn't just a mistake. It was proof. Proof that somewhere between I do and I'm done he stopped remembering what mattered to me. Not on purpose. Not out of cruelty. But maybe that's worse. Because if forgetting becomes a habit, how do you know when it turns into indifference? I sat still for a long time. The radiator hummed, the journal waited, and outside the snow kept falling like it had nowhere else to go. She hadn't walked in snow since their 5th anniversary. Back then, Caleb had surprised her with a weekend trip to Lake Placid. Cabin lights twinkled through the flurries. They drank hot cider on a porch swing and laughed when the fire wouldn't start. He'd given her red boots wrapped in tissue and duct tape. They looked warmer in the store, he'd said, grinning. She never wore them again. But this morning, without thinking, she opened the trunk before stepping out of the motel. And there they were, sitting on top of her bag like they'd waited patiently through the years. She didn't question it, she just put them on. The zipper stuck for a moment, but when she stood they fit. There was a path behind the inn. Marjorie had mentioned the day before, a narrow trail leading into trees too thin to give much cover but enough to make her feel like the rest of the world had blurred. The snow wasn't deep, just enough to hush the ground. It clung to the dead leaves, painted the branches white. Every step gave a gentle crunch beneath her soles. She didn't have a destination, but her body seemed to know something her mind didn't. That this walk wasn't about moving forward, it was about being still long enough to feel herself again. There was a kind of mercy in the cold. The way it focused you, took the noise out of things. Nora breathed slowly, her hands deep in her coat pockets, her breath a steady mist. She hadn't brought gloves. Hadn't thought about needing them. But her fingers were warm enough for now. Or maybe just numb enough to stop protesting. Behind her the pine hollow inn shrank with every step. Ahead nothing but white and the occasional flutter of a bird taking off from a branch. No one called her name, no one followed. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't mind. Somewhere between the 3rd and 4th bend she stopped walking. Not because she was tired, she wasn't. But because the silence had changed. It wasn't just absence of sound, it was listening. Like the woods were holding their breath with her. A branch cracked behind her, but it was only ice loosening its grip. She kept going. Each footfall sank half an inch. The boots surprisingly didn't pinch. She realized she'd expected them to hurt like most things tied to him did. But these didn't. She looked down at the trail. A scatter of acorn caps, windblown twigs, and empty candy wrapper someone had dropped long ago. It reminded her of the mornings back home. The kind where she'd walk into the kitchen and find the light still flickering above the stove. She'd asked him 3 times, maybe 4, to change that bulb. He said he would. But it kept blinking like an exhausted pulse until the day she moved out. Nora stepped over a patch of frost-hardened mud. She remembered the way Caleb used to rest his hand on her back as they walked. Not always, but often. A small, steady touch. And one day, it just wasn't there anymore. She never asked why. He never noticed. Or maybe he did and chose not to explain. The wind lifted a loose strand of her hair and brushed it against her cheek. She didn't tuck it behind her ear. Instead, she closed her eyes for a moment. Listened to the snow land on branches. Imagined her breath curling like smoke and floating into something larger than her. No music. No podcast. No distraction. Just her and the cold and the rhythm of boots finding their way forward. The trees thinned without warning. Suddenly, the trail opened into a clearing, flat, wide, and quiet in a way that felt deliberate, like even nature paused here. Before her stretched the lake. Frozen solid. Pale blue under a sky the color of unwashed cotton. The wind shifted. She wrapped her coat tighter but didn't step back. Something in her held still. Something else began to melt. Near the edge of the clearing, a wooden bench waited. Frost covered its surface, but not enough to hide the object placed on top, a paper-wrapped sandwich neatly folded with a small note tucked underneath. Nora approached slowly. She knew that handwriting. Marjorie's. She picked up the paper. Her fingers stiff from the cold but careful. We lose things to understand if we needed them. Or just carried them too long. She sat down. The bench creaked, finally a sound. Nora didn't open the sandwich. She didn't feel hungry. Instead, she stared out at the lake. And whispered to no one, "I still love him." It wasn't a confession. It wasn't a plea. It was the kind of truth that no longer asked to be answered. The echo that came back wasn't his voice, it was hers. Years younger, softer, still trying. She breathed out slowly. It curled in the air. Disappeared. That's what grief was, she thought. Not always screaming or sobbing. Sometimes it was just sitting still beside something frozen and realizing you'd stayed long after it stopped thawing. She sat there longer than she meant to. The sandwich grew colder. Her fingers too. But she didn't move. A tiny branch snapped somewhere in the woods behind her. She didn't flinch. Instead, she reached into her coat pocket. Her hand came out empty. Then it went to her jeans. Then her bag. The phone was at the bottom. She hadn't checked it all morning. Not since silencing her mother's call before breakfast. When she pulled it out, the screen lit up with the usual 3 missed calls, 1 from her mother, 2 from a number she didn't save, probably insurance or Caleb's lawyer. Nora didn't open any of them. She just stared at the home screen. The date glared at her, the 17th of January. Their anniversary had always been the 19th. 2 days from now. She hesitated. Then opened a blank message. Typed nothing, deleted nothing. Just sat with it. Her thumb hovered. She could almost hear him, Caleb, saying, "You're overthinking again." But that version of him no longer existed, maybe never had. She started typing, "Are you home now?" No exclamation mark, no name, no lead-in. She stared at the words. They looked harmless. But her chest felt anything but. Her thumb didn't shake when she hit send. It was too cold for shaking. Then she locked the phone. Tucked it back into her bag. And just sat there listening to the sound of her breath in a clearing that had no answer. She didn't rush back. The snow had softened beneath her soles, but her pace stayed slow even as the cold crept through her coat. Her body moved like it remembered its own weight. Not like someone escaping the cold, but like someone who'd finally stopped trying to outrun something colder. By the time the inn came into view again, the sky had begun to shift. Not quite dusk, but the kind of late afternoon light that made everything look slightly faded, like a photograph left in the sun. Marjorie wasn't at the front desk. The bell sat quiet. Nora let herself in with the key. Room 17 still smelled faintly of wood polish and heat. She dropped the bag onto the chair, kicked off the boots, then just stood in the middle of the room. Not reaching for the light, not even removing her coat. She finally sat down on the edge of the bed, letting the silence settle around her. Then the phone buzzed. Once. Not a call. A message. She picked it up. One line glowing against the black screen, "I'm not home." That was it. No name. No punctuation. But it was him. And somehow, it felt like the most honest thing he'd said in years. She stared at it, not knowing what to feel. No anger, no relief, just an ache. Quiet, deep, old. She placed the phone on the nightstand next to the journal Marjorie had given her. She didn't open it. Not yet. Instead, she whispered to the room, to the wood, the walls, to herself. "I think I've been gone too." And in that stillness, room 17 didn't answer. But it didn't need to. It was listening. He didn't answer right away. But the three dots blinked then vanished. I stared at the screen like it might say what he couldn't. Silence. Not angry silence. Not the kind that punishes. Just the kind you start slipping into when you both stop knowing what to say. That kind of silence had lived in our house long before either of us walked out. I flipped the phone over face down on the table. The motel room was quiet again, just the soft hum of the heater. Outside, snow kept falling in slow motion like it didn't care if the world moved on. I told myself I wouldn't go. But my hand was already reaching for my coat. The drive to Brattleboro didn't take long. I remembered every turn, every faded road sign, every lopsided mailbox we used to pass and laugh about. Only this time I wasn't coming home. I was coming back. That's different. His house, our old house, looked smaller in the January twilight. The porch light was on. He used to forget to switch it on when I worked late. Now it glowed like he remembered. Or maybe it was just automatic. The sidewalk hadn't been shoveled. Snow crunched under my boots, same ones I wore when we moved in that first spring. I stopped before the steps, not ready to knock. Across the street, Miss Kim was pulling a trash bin back from the curb. She caught my eye, lifted one gloved hand in a slow, gentle wave. That was all. She didn't smile, didn't frown. Just waved like people do when life moves forward and they've learned not to ask questions. I knocked once, then again. The door opened before I could find the breath to try a third time. And there he was, Caleb. Thinner, quieter in the face. Eyes softer, or maybe just tired. Hey, he said, like I'd just come back from the store. Like I hadn't left for good. I stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. The scent hit me first, Old Spice and cedar. It used to be my favorite. Now it smelled like forgetting. The living room hadn't changed much. Same couch, still a little sagged in the middle from years of late-night shows. The blanket I crocheted during lockdown was folded neatly on the armrest. He gestured for me to sit. I did. Not because I wanted to stay, just because I wasn't ready to leave yet. Caleb walked into the kitchen without a word and came back with 2 mugs of tea. No sugar. He always forgot. He placed mine down on the coffee table, then sat on the edge of the couch, a cushion away from me. Silence. No accusations. No dramatic openings. Just that dull hum of baseboard heat and the occasional pop of wood shifting in the walls. I stopped asking how your day was, I said, finally, watching the steam curl. He didn't flinch. You stopped asking if I'd slept. He looked at me then. Not with anger, not with sadness, just recognition. I stopped waiting for you to care again, he said softly. The words weren't sharp. They weren't meant to wound. They just landed. I nodded. Let the silence spread between us like snow across an empty field. He rubbed his hands together like he was cold, but I think it was just habit. There were so many things we did out of habit. I almost came to the courthouse that day, he said quietly. I looked at him. To stop it, I asked. Number. He shook his head. To see if you'd look back. I didn't respond. I couldn't tell if I had looked back. Maybe only in the rearview mirror when it was too late to turn around. On the side table beside him, I saw it, the white ceramic mug with a chipped rim. I gave it to him years ago. Printed in blue letters. Here's to small efforts. Now it held his toothbrush. That felt more honest than any explanation we ever gave each other. I wanted to remember how I felt here, I said at last. That's all. He nodded slowly. Didn't ask what I felt, didn't offer anything back, and maybe that was the point. We had stopped offering a long time ago. The fridge let out a sudden rattle from the ice machine. He turned his head like it startled him. I didn't move. I just sat there, the tea cooling untouched. And we let the house speak for us like it had always done. Quiet, present, tired. Outside, the porch light had turned orange with the dusk. I stood up. My hand grazed the back of the couch, the one we picked out together at a Memorial Day sale. It still had the faint mark where my tea once spilled the night we watched that mystery series for 5 hours straight. Caleb didn't stand. At the door, I paused. He looked at me, eyes softer than I remembered, but not full of regret. Just recognition. Like he finally saw me and knew it was too late. He didn't ask me to stay, I'd later write in my journal. And maybe that was the kindest thing. Because staying would have meant pretending. And we had done enough of that. I stepped into the cold. The air was sharper now, like it wanted to keep me awake. Across the street, Miss Kim's porch light blinked on. She waved through her window like always. I raised my hand just slightly. Then I got in my car. No music. Just the sound of gravel under the tires as I drove away from what used to be home. Not toward anything new yet. But, finally away. The silence felt different tonight. Not sharp like it had been in the car, not heavy like in Caleb's living room. This one stretched out soft like a warm quilt, thin but kind. Less like absence. More like space. I sat near the fireplace in the lobby of the Pine Hollow Inn, cradling a mug of something herbal I didn't bother to name. The flames crackled low, gentle of background voice to the distant patter of rain beginning to replace the sleet. I could smell cinnamon in the wood, maybe from something baked earlier, or maybe it had just soaked into the pine walls over years of winters like this. Around me the world continued. Soft laughter from the other end of the inn. A suitcase rolling over tile, someone's keys jingling. None of it was mine to worry about. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like freedom. I opened the journal again, fingers slow like I was touching something tender. The last page I wrote still echoed faintly in my mind, but I didn't reread it. I just let the pen settle in my hand, waited. Rain tapped at the windows, polite but insistent. I could hear my own breath steady now. Steady and mine. I didn't start with a title. Just a thought. We didn't fail, we just stopped feeding what kept us alive. The words looked smaller than they felt. But I didn't cross them out. Didn't second-guess them like I used to with every text I sent, every word I swallowed to keep the peace. I paused, let the pen fall beside the journal, not closed, just resting. Across the room, Marjorie moved like a shadow softened by lamplight. She was placing something on the side table, a small plate of shortbread and slices of clementine, bright and peeled clean. She didn't speak right away. Just sat in the chair beside me, hands in her lap like a prayer unfinished. She looked out the window as if what I needed to hear was outside, not from her. Then gently, barely above the hum of the radiator, she said, "Some return, some begin again. Either way, you're allowed." It wasn't advice, it was permission. The kind I never asked for because I never thought I deserved it. I nodded once. Didn't thank her, didn't explain, we just sat there. Two women, not naming their pasts out loud but letting them loosen their grip. The fire crackled beside us, a steady low rhythm like breathing in a quiet room. Rain tapped the windows now, no longer sleet, just soft, rhythmic water finding its way down the glass. In the lull of that hush, I noticed things I hadn't before. The way the light hit the journal pages, how they curled just a little at the corners from the heat. The way the smell of cinnamon wasn't sharp, but woven through everything gently like memory. In the distance, laughter echoed from the hallway. Other guests talking about something light, maybe nothing at all. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was standing outside of life. I touched my hair, absent-minded, a small gesture. Tucked a strand behind my ear. He used to do that. On mornings when the sun caught my face wrong and I hadn't had coffee yet. He'd tuck it back without a word, then walk away. I didn't cry thinking of it. Didn't ache. It was just a picture frame in a hallway I didn't stop in anymore. There, but not asking to be touched. And I could breathe. Not lighter, not better, just fuller. Present. Marjorie returned a few minutes later with 2 mugs. She didn't ask if I wanted tea, just brought it. The kind of gesture that felt less like service and more like presence. She placed 1 mug in front of me without a word and took the seat across. The fire painted both our faces in soft flicker, gold shifting to amber. Neither of us spoke. I sipped the tea, it tasted like something old, something herbal, maybe chamomile or verbena. It didn't matter. What mattered was that it was warm. For a while, we sat in companionable silence, the kind I hadn't had with another human in months. Maybe longer. Then, after a moment too long to feel planned, Marjorie said, almost like a thought aloud, "Some return. Some begin again. Either way, you're allowed." She didn't look at me when she said it. Just watched the logs settle deeper into embers. But the words found me. They didn't sting, they didn't soothe, they just landed, and that was enough. I leaned back, letting my shoulders rest against the cushion's edge. For the first time since arriving, I didn't feel like I was hiding. I wasn't collapsing or rebuilding, I was just here. Somewhere between what was and what might be. And that too felt allowed. I looked down at the journal again. The page I'd left open still held the weight of the last thing I'd written. We didn't fail, we just stopped feeding what kept us alive. But now my pen hovered over a fresh sheet. I didn't know exactly what to write next. And maybe that was the point. There was no neat ending to record. No speech to deliver. No apology to unearth. Only space. And the soft sound of rain ticking against the window. And the faint smell of cinnamon that clung to the inn like a memory that had chosen to stay. I folded the blank page carefully, not to tear it but to give it a crease. Then slid it into the back of the journal like a seed. At the top I wrote one thing: the 2nd of February. Start anyway. And that was it. No declarations, no resolve. Just a date. And a willingness. Marjorie had gone back to her front desk now. The fire was dying down and I knew I should sleep soon. I reached up absently, tucking a strand of hair behind my ear. Caleb used to do that. But this time the gesture was mine. The hardest thing wasn't letting him go, I thought as I turned out the lamp. It was realizing he already had. She packed light. Still, when she closed the door to room 17, it felt like something heavier stayed behind. Not the coat hanging on the chair. Not the untouched breakfast tray on the desk. Something else. The kind of weight that doesn't show up on a scale, only in the pause before you leave a place you'll never return to quite the same. She stood there, hand on the doorknob. Not turning it, not letting go. The window had fogged with the early morning chill. Beyond the glass the world shimmered under wet pavement, soft with light rain that had replaced the sleet sometime before dawn. She glanced over at the chair again. The first night it had been empty. Almost accusatory, its silence louder than anything she could name. Now it held her coat folded carefully across the back like a visitor left it behind on purpose. She stepped forward and picked it up. Not rushed. Not hesitant. Just ready. But not before opening the drawer by the bed one last time. Inside, quiet and waiting, was the pouch. She unwrapped it. The ring felt colder than she remembered. Not harsh. Just Finel. She reached into the nightstand and tucked it beside a note she'd written on the motel's paper. Don't wear it again. Don't hate it either. Just let it be a chapter. She folded the tissue back gently and closed the drawer. Then sat down on the edge of the bed. Not to delay, but to mark the moment. Because leaving, she was beginning to understand, wasn't always about the door. Sometimes it was about what you didn't take with you. She zipped up her overnight bag. It made a quiet click like punctuation. Not an exclamation, just a period. Her phone buzzed on the windowsill. A missed call. From Mom. Again, and this time a voicemail. She didn't mean to tap it, but her thumb slipped, and then her mother's voice filled the room. Hi, sweetheart. Just checking in. I know I say that a lot. I don't know what you need right now. If you want soup or someone to sit with you, I'll be here, that's all. There was a long silence at the end. Her mother didn't hang up right away. You could hear it, her breath still there, like she was waiting for Nora to speak back into the empty air. When it ended, the room felt different again. She didn't cry. But she did sit down. Again. This time on the small bench by the door, hands resting on the handle of her suitcase. She wasn't angry with her mother. She just hadn't known what to say. People meant well. But sometimes their words were like unfamiliar jackets, warm sure, but too tight in the arms. Nora breathed in. The lavender scent still lingered. She let it settle in her chest before standing up once more. This time she didn't hesitate. She opened the door, but before stepping out, she glanced at the bed, at the drawer, at the ring she'd left behind. No second guessing. No one would know it was hers. And maybe that was the point. The lobby was warm. Not just heated, but human. Marjorie stood behind the desk, organizing receipts with her usual slow precision. She didn't look up when Nora stepped in. Not right away. The fire crackled softly in the hearth. The rain outside tapped against the windows in a kind rhythm. Someone laughed faintly from another room, just one beat of life continuing. Nora stepped closer, holding the journal in her hands, the same one Marjorie had given her without question. The pages weren't full, but they weren't empty either. She set it gently on the counter. Marjorie looked up finally. Her eyes were soft but alert, as if she'd already known the moment had arrived. Nora spoke first. "I didn't write anything profound," she said. Her voice was calm, just true. Marjorie didn't ask to read it. She simply reached out and ran a hand over the cover once, like it was something familiar. Then Nora added quietly, "Leave it for someone else." Marjorie nodded, not as an answer, but as an agreement. No smile. Just that steady gaze, both knowing and kind. Then came the only words she offered. "Come back different, not better." Nora almost said thank you. Almost asked what that had meant. But she didn't. Because she already understood. Outside, the air smelled like thawing earth and old pine. The sleet had passed. The sky was silver brighter, but not clear. It didn't need to be. Nora placed her bag in the trunk of the car. Before sliding into the driver's seat, she paused just long enough to feel the breath leave her. A full exhale. She didn't rush. She reached into the coat pocket for her keys and felt something else. Cold. Slightly jagged. The motel key. Room 17. She turned it over in her hand. The brass tag still faintly warm from her palm. There was a moment where she considered walking back, sliding it across the desk to Marjorie like a thank you without words, but she didn't. Instead, she slipped it back into her pocket. Not out of sentimentality, not even out of forgetfulness. Just instinct. Some things you return. Some you carry forward, not as baggage, but as proof you lived through something. She drove slowly at first. Let the tires ease into the road, wet from the morning's rain. The windshield wipers squeaked twice, then quieted. She didn't turn on the radio. Didn't reach for a podcast or a playlist. Silence didn't scare her the way it used to. At the intersection, instead of turning toward the highway, she went the other way into town. She wasn't sure why. She parked in front of a small cafe with fogged windows and a crooked sign that read Maple and Thread. It wasn't planned. But neither was most of this week. Inside, the place smelled like warm bread and overbrewed coffee. A few locals sat near the front, hunched over their phones or crossword puzzles, jackets damp from the morning rain. She ordered a coffee black and sat near the window. There was a moment where she reached for her phone again. Not to call. Just to check if Caleb had texted back. He hadn't. And this time the silence didn't sting. It just was. She sipped slowly. Let the bitterness rest on her tongue. Outside, cars passed, life unbothered. A little girl near the counter knocked over a box of sugar packets and began picking them up one by one. Her mother didn't scold her. Just helped, kneeling beside her in silence. Nora watched them for a moment. Not with longing. Not with ache. Just presence. And it was enough. She reached for a napkin and scribbled on the back in pen. Some things don't heal, they just stop needing your attention. She didn't take it with her. She folded it once and left it on the table as she stood up to leave. Back in the car, she looked at her reflection in the rearview mirror. Not to fix anything. Just to see herself. For once, she didn't look like someone who had to explain. She just looked like someone real. As she pulled onto the road that curved around the edge of the valley, the Pine Hollow Inn disappeared behind a stand of fir trees. She didn't try to glimpse it again. But just as she reached the last bend, her mirror caught at the sign. It flickered once like breath catching. Then it steadied. Nora kept driving. No music, no narration. Just the sound of her own breath and the faint rattle of the motel key in her coat pocket. She wasn't going home. Not yet. But she was no longer lost. The coat she once wore for someone else fit her now. Not perfectly, but like something softened by time. At the next light, she rolled down the window. The air smelled like rain and wood smoke. And somewhere between what was and what will be, she let the silence stay. Not to fill it. Not to fight it. Just to let it hold her for a while before she moved again.